We are continuing to monitor the fallout in the wake of the death of George Floyd. Protests intensified across the country last night as activists continue to demand action and accountability for Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, two other African Americans who were also recently killed. Antjuan Seawright is here with insight on how both the President of the United States and former Vice President Joe Biden are responding to these protests. He is a CBS News political contributor. Antjuan, let's start with the president. He responded to protests across the country in a series of tweets. One of his tweets said, quote, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." There's a historical antecedent to that quote, whether or not the president realizes it. He also referred to the protesters as thugs, and the president is already facing backlash on top of his coronavirus response. But let's specifically focus on those series of tweets. What do you make of the president's language directed at the citizens of Minneapolis?
Well, I'm not surprised at all that Donald Trump, the president of the United States, would say things like this, because he has a history of saying things to not only get a certain response from a certain group of people in this country, but he also has a history of painting a very racial divisive nature by way of his tweets. I'm old enough to remember just a few weeks ago when protesters with AK-47s and every other type gun showed up in Michigan, including Confederate flags, and he called those very nice people. And yet he called people who were protesting after the death of a black man at the hands of white law enforcement officers, he called them thug in his tweets. And we know that's just his own way of using right-wing, toned-down racial rhetoric to speak to a group of people in this country that obviously are tickled and enjoy that type of rhetoric coming from the leader of the free world. As it relates to the looting and the shooting comment, we all know the historical natures behind those type comments, and we also know the danger that come along with them, because when the president says certain things, when the leader of the free world says certain things, it triggers a certain response from certain people in this country. If you do not believe me, look at his comments about digesting or injecting disinfectant into your body, or taking drugs that the CDC have said that will not be noteworthy or would do the right thing as it relates to healing coronavirus. So they all come with a price to pay. I just pray and hope that that price that comes along with this does not mean death or violence for any person in this country.
Antjuan, I know that, you know, anyone who's seen that video cannot help but to be moved by it. I know personally for me, friends of mine who are particularly parents of sons found it very, very difficult to sleep at night after watching that video. And this is sort of personal for you. Can you talk about the impact of this for you on a personal level?
Well, I haven't been able to sleep. I've had my share of tears over the past several nights or so, and I've had a number of conversations. The first thing came to my mind was another African-American family, another black family, has to plan a funeral with Father's Day just a few weeks away. A black man who should have been going on to his bed to sleep another night will be sleeping in a grave for years to come. That went through my mind. The second thing that went through my mind was the fact that I had to look in the face of my nephew and some of my friends who are raising little black and brown boys, and try to help them digest and process this and how to best explain this to their children and to their godson and so forth. The third thing that came to my mind, as you both know, I grew up in rural South Carolina. My grandparents were sharecroppers. So I remember very, very vividly sitting on the back porch while they were shelling peas, eating plums, and hearing the stories of how black people, particularly black men, were treated like second-class citizens during my sharecropping grandparents' day. And the image and the experiences that I heard from them are the same images and experiences that I am speaking about directly to you this morning, and it very much so reminds me of some of the stories I heard them talk about when I saw the video from Minnesota. And so all those things went through my mind. And then lastly, it reminds me that that could have easily been me or my brother or my nephew or someone I know, because none of us are exempt from these things. And I remember my grandmother telling me there were times which even when you did the right thing, that does not mean that it will end up being the right thing. And that is the best example I can describe about what happened in Minnesota. From all the tapes and footage I've seen and the world has seen, I don't think there was some sort of resisting of arrest, but 9 minutes with a knee on the neck and hearing a black man cry out for his mother that resulted in a death. It's very heartbreaking.
Just listening to you, Antjuan, I can hear the pain in your voice, and I can only imagine what it's been like for you, and certainly for the citizens of Minneapolis in light of all this. I want to ask you about former Vice President Joe Biden and what kind of pressure that he may be, or the campaign may be under, when it comes to his choice for a vice president. Is it an imperative, in your estimation, in your opinion and analysis, for Vice President Biden to choose a person of color as his vice presidential nominee?
Well, I will continue to say that as the son of a black woman, the younger brother of a black woman, someone with 3 nieces, and the grandson of sharecropping black women from South Carolina, nothing would do my heart more glad than having an African-American woman on the ticket who can speak to the experiences of the most loyal and dominant constituency in a generation, and that's African-American voters. I think at the end of the day, when these things happen, it makes the case even more for people who second guess the idea of having an African-American woman on the ticket. It also, I think, fertilizes the ground for an African-American woman to be rooted, planted, and nurtured on the ticket for Joe Biden. So naturally, these things happen. And when you look at the rhetoric that comes from Donald Trump, that I think is very fluent in white privilege, and what this election could mean for people who look like me, because as Karen Bass said, this is a survival vote for black people. I think all of those things, when you add them all up, gives you the right formula that should equate to an African-American on the ticket. But just in case, for whatever reason, it's not, the stakes are so high that I'm still going to do everything in my power to make certain Joe Biden is the next president of the United States.
So we never got a chance to ask you about this when it happened. Joe Biden was on the Breakfast Club. You remember last week, he said something that caught a lot of people off guard. If you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black. He subsequently sort of clarified and apologized and rephrased and all that sort of stuff. But I'm wondering how you feel that comment has aged over the past week.
Well, I'll tell you what, had he said that comment a week later with the moment we're in, I think people would have not been up in arms as they were just last week, because obviously there's a big difference in the two individuals. And I think that has been highlighted as a result of the things that have happened over the past few days. Secondly, as I said in the Washington Post, I perhaps would have said it differently, but I think what the vice president was trying to articulate, that when you look at his body of work, and you look at what he has done, what he is doing, and what he will do if he were to be the president of the United States, compared to what Donald Trump has said, what Donald Trump has done, and what we know he will do if he were to be elected to a second term, I think what the VP was saying is that the picture is crystal clear. But I want to remind people who may have been upset, who may have been bothered by his comments, Vice President Biden's comments, we cannot govern if we do not win. And the fact of the matter is, an African-American agenda from Joe Biden, if he wins, we know will be implemented. Talking points, racial divisive rhetoric from Donald Trump will continue to happen if he were elected to another term. So the stakes are high, and the picture is crystal clear for me. And I hope that everyone who looks like me and who believes like I believe will adopt the same type of philosophy and thinking.
So one more question for you. The president tweeted, I think, a couple days ago that he's, asked the Justice Department to investigate. We've seen, instances like this, not this bad before, where the Justice Department under this administration hasn't intervened. So I wondered, when you heard the president say that, of course, he's asked the Justice Department to investigate some time ago, what your take on that was? I'm
convinced not by what people say, by what people do. And I've seen the history of Donald Trump and some of the things he said, and I've seen what he has done since he's been in office. And of course, a political moment is easy for him to take advantage of because he enjoys the highest office in our land. But when you think about the structural reforms that need to take place, and when you think about comments he's made in the past, and some of the policy agenda items, and some of the things that he's implemented or pushed for or advocated for since he's been in office, the rhetoric does not match up with the record. And I think that we all have to be crystal clear about that. I'm not interested in having my ears tickled for the satisfaction of a moment. What I'm looking for is structural change that will impact and change generations. And I think these things, as they continue to happen, will flush out some of the things that Donald Trump has done as we get closer into this election cycle.
All right, Antjuan Seawright, thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.